In a world where over 70% of African nations still criminalize homosexuality, one small West African country has just drawn a line more boldly than most. Burkina Faso has announced a new law that declares homosexuality a crime, punishable by 2 to 5 years in prison and heavy fines. This is not a quiet adjustment in legal codes. It is a thunderous declaration of sovereignty, a refusal to bend under Western pressure, and a message that the nation will guard its cultural and moral fabric no matter the cost. The news, announced by the Justice Minister, reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. International organizations immediately condemned the law. Western governments called it a violation of human rights, and rights groups raised their voices in outrage. Yet within the streets of Ouagadougou and the villages beyond, the story felt very different. For many citizens, this was not a step backward, but a step toward protecting traditions, faith, and identity from a tide of foreign influence that has for too long dictated the rhythm of African life. At the center of the storm stands Ibrahem Traore, the young leader who has made it clear that Burkina Faso will no longer submit to dictates from Washington, Brussels, or Paris. His leadership is not just about military sovereignty, or the removal of foreign troops, or reclaiming control of resources. It is about something deeper, the right of a people to decide for themselves what kind of society they want to build. And in his eyes, that society cannot be written by outsiders who neither share nor respect the foundations upon which his nation rests. But this decision comes at a price. Laws of this kind have never been just local matters. They ignite global debates, diplomatic tensions, and economic consequences. Already, foreign governments are hinting at aid restrictions, and international NGOs are threatening sanctions. Western media frames the move as evidence of intolerance, painting Burkina Faso as a nation retreating into the shadows. Yet the reality for many Burkinabe is the exact opposite. They see it as stepping into the light of independence, free from cultural imperialism. The problem is clear. On one side, there's a powerful bloc of Western nations that has grown accustomed to tying financial aid and political support to the adoption of social reforms, including the legalization of same-sex relationships. On the other, there is a proud nation asserting that sovereignty must include the right to chart its own moral course, even if that course runs against the grain of Western expectations. This clash is not simply about sexuality. It is about identity, dignity, and the very meaning of freedom. Burkina Faso's new law has sparked outrage abroad, but within the country it has sparked something else: pride. And that pride is not just about rejecting homosexuality. It is about rejecting the idea that outside powers can endlessly dictate how Africa should live, believe, or govern itself. The decision may ignite diplomatic battles and economic retaliation, but for Ibrahem Traore and the people who support him, it is a risk worth taking to protect the essence of who they are. The world is now watching. Will Burkina Faso be punished, isolated, and pressured into submission? Or will this bold defiance inspire other African nations to rise and defend their sovereignty in the same way? One thing is certain. This moment marks the beginning of a much larger struggle, and the stakes are far greater than any single law. To understand why this law has struck such a powerful chord, we must go back, far beyond today's headlines. Burkina Faso is not just another poor African state struggling to find its place in the modern world. It is a country whose soil has been soaked with the weight of history, resistance, and survival. Once known as Upper Volta under French colonial rule, the nation's destiny was shaped by a century of outside control, where decisions about governance, culture, and resources were made in Paris rather than Ouagadougou. Even after independence in 1960, the grip of foreign powers never truly loosened. Western governments, multinational corporations, and international financial institutions all found ways to tie the country's future to their own agendas. Aid came with conditions. Loans came with demands. Security assistance came with strings attached. And perhaps most dangerously, cultural values came packaged as requirements for modernization. For decades, Burkina Faso has been told that progress means copying the West. That development means accepting not just foreign investments, but foreign ways of life. And those who refused often paid the price. Leaders who resisted too strongly were undermined, pressured, or overthrown. Societies that clung too tightly to their traditions were painted as backward or intolerant. This pattern is not unique to Burkina Faso. It is echoed across the African continent. But what makes this moment different is that the nation's current leadership is no longer willing to accept this cycle as inevitable. The debate over homosexuality, then, is not a standalone issue. It is the latest chapter in a long struggle for cultural and political sovereignty. Western governments often present their advocacy for LGBTQ rights in Africa as a noble fight for human dignity. But for many in Burkina Faso, it is perceived as yet another form of imperialism, softer than military occupation, but equally intrusive. When aid is tied to adopting laws that run against the beliefs of the majority, it no longer feels like partnership. It feels like coercion. This is where Ibrahem Traore has distinguished himself. Unlike many leaders before him, he has chosen to speak directly to this pressure rather than sidestepping it. In his speeches, he makes it clear that Africa cannot be free if its people cannot choose their own moral compass. For him, the question is not simply whether homosexuality should be legal or illegal. The deeper question is, who decides? Should it be the citizens of Burkina Faso, guided by their culture, religion, and traditions? Or should it be international bodies headquartered thousands of miles away, imposing rules on nations they scarcely understand? This is why the new law has been received by many Burkinabe not as an act of hate, but as an act of defiance. It represents a refusal to let outsiders dictate what is acceptable within their own society. It is a rejection of conditional sovereignty, where independence exists only on paper, but not in practice. And it is a reminder that freedom is not just about borders and flags, but about the right to define one's own identity as a people. Of course, this is not without risks. Western powers have immense leverage over Burkina Faso. They provide aid, security support, and access to international markets. They control the institutions that set the rules of global trade and finance. And they have powerful platforms that shape the narrative about what is right and wrong in the world. To stand against them is to invite punishment, isolation, sanctions, or worse. But in the eyes of many Burkinabe, that price may be worth paying if it means escaping a cycle of dependence and control. The passage of this law is therefore more than a legal adjustment. It is a statement of intent. It is Ibrahem Traore's way of telling the world that Burkina Faso will not be remade in someone else's image. And in doing so, he has positioned his nation not just as a small country making a controversial decision, but as a symbol of Africa's larger struggle to reclaim its voice in a world that too often seeks to silence it. The tension reached its height when Ibrahem Traore addressed the issue directly, not behind closed doors, not through vague diplomatic language, but openly, in front of his people and the international community. His words carried the unmistakable tone of a leader who has had enough. Enough of being lectured, enough of being dictated to, and enough of being told that sovereignty is conditional. He began by pointing to a truth that resonates deeply across Africa, that no nation can truly be independent if it does not decide its own laws. To Traore, Burkina Faso's decision to criminalize homosexuality was not about hatred. It was about ownership of identity. We are a people with our own history, our own traditions, our own values, he declared, in a voice that rang with conviction. We cannot be forced to abandon them simply because another part of the world has chosen a different path. The reaction was immediate. Western governments condemned the statement, framing it as a betrayal of human rights. Threats of aid cuts and sanctions quickly followed. Activists abroad painted Traore as intolerant, a figure dragging his nation backward. But inside Burkina Faso, the mood was strikingly different. Crowds gathered in support, waving national flags, chanting his name, and praising his willingness to say what so many African leaders have hesitated to voice aloud. For years, African nations have walked a delicate line, balancing their cultural convictions with the expectations of Western donors. Many leaders quietly upheld laws against homosexuality, but avoided making them central to political debate, fearing backlash from abroad. Traore chose a different path. He embraced the confrontation, not as a liability, but as a stage to assert independence. In doing so, he turned a domestic policy into a symbol of defiance, a rallying cry that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Consider the context. At a time when Burkina Faso has already expelled foreign troops, turned away international interference in its security, and asserted control over its natural resources, this law adds another layer to the story. It signals that sovereignty is not just military or economic, but cultural. For Traore, allowing outsiders to dictate the nation's moral values would be no different from allowing them to dictate how much gold, oil, or uranium Burkina Faso can sell. Both, in his eyes, are violations of independence. And so, in that charged moment, he challenged not only Western leaders but also African ones. His defiance posed an uncomfortable question to the continent. If sovereignty means anything, then why are so many African governments still afraid to chart their own moral course? Why must aid and approval always come at the cost of identity? It was this framing that turned the law into a lightning rod. On international news channels, the story was reduced to a headline: Burkina Faso criminalizes homosexuality. But within the country and across much of Africa, the story was understood differently. Burkina Faso defies the West. The distinction is crucial. For Western audiences, the law was about rights. For Burkinabe, it was about power. This clash of perspectives makes the moment so pivotal. Traore knew that by passing this law, he was risking economic retaliation. He knew that Western governments would threaten to suspend aid, restrict trade, and isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. But he also knew something else, that silence would be worse. To accept Western conditions quietly would mean surrendering not just on this issue, but on every issue to come. And so, the law became a weapon not against individuals, but against a system of control that has long dictated the choices of African nations. It was Traore's way of saying, if you threaten us with sanctions, then let the world see clearly what you are sanctioning. You are not punishing us for breaking international law. You are punishing us for refusing to abandon our traditions. The climax of this confrontation is not just the passing of the law itself, but the symbolism it carries. In a single act, Burkina Faso placed itself at the center of a global debate. It dared to reject what had become almost universal in the West. It dared to say that independence means more than waving a flag on Independence Day. And it dared to remind the world that Africa is not a blank slate upon which others can write their values. The courage of such a stance is not without consequence. Burkina Faso is a small, landlocked nation with limited resources and immense challenges. It faces threats from insurgencies, poverty, and instability. To risk alienating powerful allies at such a moment may seem reckless to some. Yet to others, it is the only path forward. For Traore and those who support him, dependence is the greater danger. To live forever under the shadow of Western dictates, even in exchange for aid, would mean never truly being free. And so, in this defining moment, Burkina Faso has chosen confrontation over compliance, dignity over dependence, sovereignty over silence. The law has been passed, the words have been spoken, and the line has been drawn. But what comes next for Burkina Faso may prove even more significant than the act itself. Already, Western governments are weighing their options. Diplomatic cables warn of aid cuts. International NGOs raise the alarm about rights violations. Foreign media runs headlines designed to shame and isolate the country. Yet, despite the pressure, the tone inside Burkina Faso remains one of resilience rather than regret. For the people who fill its streets, this is not just about one law. It is about finally watching a leader take risks on their behalf, refusing to bow under international pressure. For too long, decisions in African capitals have been made with one eye on foreign approval. But now, with Ibrahem Traore's defiance, there is a sense that the compass has shifted. Approval from abroad matters less than dignity at home. The consequences will not be easy. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy nation. It depends on international aid and access to global markets. Sanctions, trade restrictions, or diplomatic isolation could cut deeply. But Traore seems to understand that the price of submission is heavier than the price of defiance. If Burkina Faso bends now, it sends a signal that its sovereignty can always be bought or threatened into compliance. By standing firm, even in the face of consequences, it sends the opposite message, that independence is priceless. Beyond its borders, the impact of this decision may ripple across the continent. Other African nations are watching closely. Many of them face the same pressures, the same conditional aid packages, the same quiet insistence that cultural change is a prerequisite for partnership. If Burkina Faso survives this storm with its sovereignty intact, it may embolden others to follow. The question is not whether the law will inspire debate. It already has. The question is whether it will inspire action. And there lies a deeper significance. This is not just a story about Burkina Faso or about one controversial law. It is a story about the crossroads at which Africa now stands. One path leads to continued dependence, where outside powers dictate values, policies, and futures. The other path leads to sovereignty, where African nations, for better or worse, make their own choices and face the consequences themselves. For Ibrahem Traore, the choice is clear. For many in his country, it is worth the risk. The world will continue to react. There will be criticism, condemnations, and campaigns. There may be economic pressure or even political attempts to undermine this government. But there will also be admiration from those who see in this defiance a spark of courage that has long been absent in global politics, whether one agrees with the law or not. It is undeniable that Burkina Faso has forced the world to pay attention. It has shifted the conversation from quiet compliance to unapologetic independence. And so, as we look forward, we must ask, will Burkina Faso stand alone, or will others join its call for cultural sovereignty? Will the West double down on punishment? Or will it eventually recognize that partnership cannot come through coercion? The answers to these questions will shape not only Burkina Faso's future, but the future of Africa's relationship with the wider world. What is clear is this: a new chapter has begun. Burkina Faso has chosen its path, boldly and unapologetically. Whatever happens next, this moment will be remembered as a point when a small nation stood tall, when a leader refused to bend, and when sovereignty was measured not just in words, but in action. Now, the question turns to you, the viewer. Do you see this as a reckless decision that will bring suffering, or as a courageous act of independence that will inspire others? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's open this discussion together. And if you want to explore more stories about Africa's fight for sovereignty, leadership, and independence, check out the related videos on this channel. Your voice, your perspective, and your engagement matter, because the story of Burkina Faso is not just about one country. It is about the universal struggle for freedom, dignity, and the right of every nation to choose its own destiny. But the story does not end here. To truly grasp the significance of this law, we must look beyond the immediate reactions and examine the deeper currents it has set in motion. Across Africa, the debate about sovereignty versus foreign influence is gaining momentum. Leaders in neighboring countries are watching closely, calculating their own responses, and asking whether the time has come to challenge external agendas more openly. In villages and cities alike, people discuss not just the morality of the law, but what it represents. A declaration that Africa has a right to define itself without waiting for approval from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. This is why Burkina Faso's decision is more than a national policy. It is a continental signal. It says, if one small nation, long dismissed as fragile, can stand up to the world's most powerful voices, then perhaps others can too. That is both inspiring and threatening, depending on which side of the conversation you stand. For citizens who have grown tired of watching their resources leave while their poverty remains, it is a spark of hope. For governments that rely on aid and alliances, it is a complicated gamble. And for the West, it is a warning that the old playbook of pressure and conditions may no longer work as effectively as before. This law cannot be separated from the larger struggle over African identity. For centuries, African societies developed their own codes of conduct, spiritual systems, and cultural norms. Many of those traditions were interrupted, reshaped, or outright destroyed during colonization. What Burkina Faso has done is to revive the conversation about who gets to decide what is right or wrong for Africans. Is it the international community with its treaties and declarations, or is it the people themselves, through leaders who claim to represent their values? In that question lies the essence of sovereignty. The ban on homosexuality is therefore not simply a legal statute, but a referendum on the right of Africans to chart their own moral compass. The health debate has also entered the picture. Supporters of the ban argue that unrestricted acceptance of homosexuality can bring long-term health challenges, not only psychological but also medical. They point to studies that highlight higher rates of sexually transmitted infections and related complications in same-sex populations. For them, the law is not only about preserving tradition, but about protecting the well-being of society. Critics reject this, saying health arguments are being misused to justify repression. But a fact remains: Burkina Faso has turned health, morality, and sovereignty into one intertwined discussion, forcing people to confront questions that go far beyond simple legality. There's also the geopolitical dimension. Burkina Faso is not acting in isolation. Across the continent, other nations have passed or are considering similar measures, often sparking diplomatic crises. The West has threatened aid cuts, sanctions, and restrictions on international cooperation. But with the rise of new global partners such as Russia, China, and regional African alliances, the balance of power is shifting. Countries like Burkina Faso are beginning to realize that Western approval is no longer their only lifeline. This creates space for bold moves, and Traore has seized that opportunity. By standing firm, he sends a message to his people and to the world that his nation is no longer willing to trade value for dollars. Yet the situation is far from simple. Aid dependency runs deep, and international isolation can bring real pain to ordinary citizens. If foreign funding is cut, if trade slows, if sanctions tighten, who will pay the price? These are the risks Burkina Faso has chosen to embrace, and only time will reveal whether the gamble pays off. But in the eyes of many citizens, dignity and self-respect are worth the cost. Better to suffer with independence, they argue, than to prosper under conditions that erode the very fabric of their society. Another dimension is the generational divide. Young Africans, often more exposed to global culture through social media, are caught between two worlds. Some embrace Western ideas of identity and freedom, while others feel a strong pull to preserve traditional values. The law, therefore, becomes a battlefield of generations as much as of politics. Will the youth align with the defiance of their leaders, or will they quietly resist, waiting for another shift in the future? That uncertainty makes the story even more complex, and its outcome harder to predict. We must also acknowledge the voices of ordinary people. For many families in Burkina Faso, the law is not an abstract idea, but something that touches their daily lives. Parents discuss it with their children. Faith leaders preach about it in mosques and churches. Elders debate it in village councils. Some feel relief, believing their culture is being defended. Others feel fear, worried about witch hunts or unjust accusations. In this way, the law reaches deep into the social fabric, reshaping conversations and relationships. Globally, Burkina Faso has become a flashpoint. Human rights organizations have condemned the decision, framing it as a step backward for freedom. Western governments are reevaluating their partnerships. Media headlines portray Traore either as a hero of sovereignty or as a dictator in the making. This polarization ensures that Burkina Faso will remain at the center of international debate for months, if not years, to come. But perhaps the most striking impact is psychological. For decades, African nations were told that they must follow Western guidance to survive. Today, Burkina Faso is showing that survival can take a different form, one grounded in defiance, in cultural pride, and in a willingness to accept consequences. That psychological shift from dependency to defiance may prove to be the most lasting legacy of this law. The choice Burkina Faso has made has forced the world to talk. News headlines, policy debates, diplomatic exchanges, all are now circling around a small West African nation that was often ignored in the past. In one stroke, it has placed itself at the center of a global conversation. Whether history will judge this as a bold step of independence or a dangerous retreat into isolation remains to be seen. But what is certain is that the courage to make such a decision in the face of enormous pressure has already written a new chapter in the story of Africa's fight for self-determination.